Why? Because of loopholes. You know how that term always seems to come in when we're talking about the government? You know, all these loopholes. Well, typically they're not loopholes at all. What they're actually are nooses. And those nooses go around our necks and, okay, that's what they are, not loopholes. So may I suggest some salt with that helping of information you have there? Did you ever hear that saying, take it with a grain of salt? Well, it's never been more applicable than I think it is here today, especially in regards to current events and things that are happening politically. Yeah, you better be taking it all with a grain of salt. And whether you get your information from the mainstream or the alternative, it doesn't matter these days. You better always be taking it with a grain of salt. And for many of us, you know, we recognize that the mainstream, well, although they like to parade themselves as keeping you informed with the news and trustworthy sources, for many of us, we see through the jargon now for what it is. And, you know, in large part, a lot of people, unless you're a boomer or, you know, I guess late stage Gen X, you probably don't pay any attention to it. But that doesn't much matter these days because it's found its way, you know, onto the alternative scene and it's everywhere. So it is what it is. But at least if you know to take that information with a grain of salt, well, I'd say you're one step ahead of many. But that's where we're at. That's where we're at. Especially in a time of, because in a time of also comes propaganda. And hopefully most of us are at least somewhat acquainted with what that is and how we don't have to look too far in history to see it in action. Because it's clear in, you know, the ones that are in recorded history here that we have access to some of the information. Well, it's clear that it was at work then, alive and doing well today still. You know, and it's through that they were able to, you know, sway opinions, to persuade the masses, even to drive and, I guess, control, you know, ideologies. But it's still alive. It's still alive and doing well. And if you weren't aware, we are in that time of, once again. And so if you're like many, you should be questioning what's up with all the contradictions lately, right? Because I've seen a lot of people questioning it. It just seems like there's all these contradictions coming from all of, you know, the media sources here lately. What's going on? Well, I think first we need to understand that not only are we in a physical, but we are also in a spiritual. And that spiritual is for your mind. Okay? Let's make sure we first understand that fundamental understanding. Because you are definitely in that. And you have been since you were born, if you haven't yet noticed. And so what's up with all these contradictions here lately? Hopefully you're a little bit acquainted with them, because there are many, and I'm not going to certainly get into them all here today, but we will talk about a few, like this one where, you know, Trump came out saying, oh, you know, in regards to the image that he had AI generated, he first had this to say.
Mr. President, did you post that picture of yourself depicted as Jesus Christ?
Well, it wasn't depicted. It was me. I did post it, and I thought it was me as the doctor, and it had to do with Red Cross, as a Red Cross worker there, which we support. And only the fake news could come up with that one. So I just heard about it, and I said, how did they come up with that? It's supposed to be me as a doctor, making people better, and I do make people better. I make people a lot better. As an example, the 11,000, I understand your husband's going through treatment.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
He's
He
going
has
through some
cancer.
very serious cancer treatment, so
Yes, sir.
this goes a long way.
Yes, sir. It sure does.
And then I think later that same day, he had this to say.
We're not so happy about the image of you looking like the Pope.
Oh, I see. You mean they can't take a joke? You don't mean the Catholics, you mean the fake news media. Not the Catholics loved it. I had nothing to do with it. Somebody made up a picture of me dressed like the Pope, and they put it out on the internet. That's not me that did it. I have no idea where it came from. Maybe it was AI, but I know nothing about it. I just saw it last evening. Actually, my wife thought it was cute. She said, isn't that nice?
My question about
Actually, I would not be able to be married, though. That would be a lot. I'd have to the best of my knowledge, popes aren't big on getting married, are they? Not that we know of, no. No, I think it's the fake news media that, you know, they're fakers.
Or maybe we can talk about how, you know, he had this to say about the straight. And then later, this is what the reality was in regards to the straight. And I know that, you know, things are always changing in times like this, but do you think it's they can't keep their information straight, or they know exactly what they're doing? See, I would bet that it's the latter, that they know exactly what they're doing, because that, for your mind, well, see, this is all part of it, and this is how it works. And it's through that propaganda that they do this. And if you're wondering, well, how is that legal? Like, how can they do this? How can they, you know, seemingly lie to their own people? Well, that just happens to be what we're here to talk about today. Because back in 2025, towards the end of 2025, last year, hold on to something called the Mundt Modernization Act. And originally, the Mundt Act was part of the United States Information and Education Exchange Act of 1948. And guess what else happened in 1948? You know, 1948 is a very, very important year. If you weren't aware of it, you should really look into what all took place around that time frame, because it's a key time in history for sure. But whatever you do, don't allow that certain group of Christians to tell you that that's when the prophetic clock started ticking. Okay? Don't fall for that. And that's not what we're going to get into here today. I'm going to just dance around that one for now and leave that alone. And we'll just leave that right there, because that's a topic of itself. But we're here to talk about this Mundt Modernization Act, because in 2012, the legislation was frequently cited as allowing the U.S. government to use propaganda on its own citizens. And there was an amendment back then in 2013 to the National Defense Authorization Act that is the topic of concern here, and why, you know, we could be seeing some of these things that we're seeing here so blatantly obvious today, right out in the wide open. Many, many contradictions. But it was signed into effect by President Obama back in 2013. And this act, it amended the United States Information and Education Exchange Act of 1948, the Smith-Mundt Act, modifying its original prohibitions on domestic dissemination of government-produced media. And I encourage you to look into this more. The information's out there. I'm reading this to you right from the source. You know, you can find it yourself. So go do a little research. But what I'd like to talk about today is the more recent concerns with this, because like I said, in late 2025, that's when I stumbled onto it. And the reason that it was being discussed then is because it became relevant again when there were numerous things trying to be passed through the government that would prevent them from using this act to propagandize its own people. And so it was very relevant there, you know, during that time when this was happening, because that's how this works, right? We are distracted, and while we're distracted by all these different things going on, these type of things are happening in the background, and they are becoming law. And so that's how this works. And if you haven't noticed, typically while you're distracted and these things are passing through and becoming law, well, what's actually happening is more and more of your rights and liberties are just being taken away. If I had to sum it up in layman's terms, that's what's happening. And in my opinion, the biggest one, at least the one that I'm most familiar with, was back in the early 2000s with the Patriot Act. That was a big one. And I think that you lost rights in that one that you didn't even know you had. Okay. But that's definitely what took place with that one. And it's still happening today. This stuff is alive and doing well, people. Unfortunately. Better start paying attention. But when we're talking about the contradiction here of information that we're constantly seeing today, I think in large part the reason they can get away with it is because of this. And so let's talk about, you know, some of the things with this, because back in 2017, the law expanded government efforts by establishing the Global Engagement Center, the GEC, and under the State Department, its stated purpose was to counter foreign influence campaigns from countries like Russia and China. But critics, pay attention, raised concerns that it further blurred the lines between further and domestic information operations. Why? Because of loopholes. You know how that term always seems to come in when we're talking about the government, you know, all these loopholes. Well, typically they're not loopholes at all. What they're actually are nooses. And those nooses go around our necks and, okay, that's what they are, not loopholes. But anyway, as of early 2026, there have been several new legislative attempts to address or reverse these laws because people are recognizing it. And just so you're familiar with some of them, there was a repeal of the Mundt Modernization Act, and it was introduced October 25th, October of 2025, and this bill seeks to restore the firewall that originally prohibited the domestic dissemination of government-produced propaganda. It aims to prevent federal agencies like the State Department from using influence campaigns on the American public. And then the Charlie Kirk Act, introduced in September 2025 by Senator Mike Lee, this legislation explicitly seeks to block the federal government from propagandizing its own citizens and shaping media narratives. And then the SPIN Act, the Stopping Propaganda Introduction Nationally, and this was introduced in 2025, late 2025, and this bill aims to close the loopholes that allow government-funded media originally intended for foreign publics to be accessible or repurposed for domestic audiences. Are you seeing the common thread here, folks? It seems we have a breach, a problem, in regards to this act and what it was initially set out to do, which was to, prevent certain things from happening, foreign-wise, internationally, in terms of foreign relations. But now it seems that there's a big concern that it's being used domestically. And then you have the Defund Government-Sponsored Propaganda Act, and these 2025 bills specifically target federal funding for organizations like PBS and NPR, labeling certain publicly funded media as state-sponsored propaganda. And it is a significant development. The Global Engagement Center, GEC, officially closed in late 2024 after its authorization was allowed to expire without renewal. Its former functions and personnel were reportedly transferred to other sections within the State Department, public diplomacy bureaus. And so, yeah, as you can see here, folks, that could maybe be why you're seeing so many contradictions. And so, again, just keep in mind that pinch of salt when you're taking in that information. Anyway, this is Thumper. As always, sorry about your toes if you stepped on them.